Hi, everyone. This is Amy Elizabeth with Right On Con. I am so excited to be talking to author Jessica Leake about researching historical fiction and fantasy. Thank you so much for joining us, Jessica. How are you today?
Thanks. How are you, Amy? I'm doing
Um,
well.
I'm good. So let's dive right in. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your books?
Okay, well, let's see. I'm a mom of four kids. The oldest is six, and then I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an 18-month-old. And I have my master's in social work. So I used to work as a psychotherapist, like at a psychiatric hospital. Um, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. That's how I practice that. And now I'm a full time mom and writer. Um, so my young adult debut is coming out this year in April. It's Beyond a Darkened Shore, and it is set in medieval Ireland um, during the time when the Vikings were raiding. And but before that, I have two adult books. They're published by Skyhorse, and Beyond a Darkened Shore is coming out from Harper Teen. And the two other books are actually they're historical fantasy too. They're just set in Edwardian era England. So
Okay,
yeah, so all of my books are historical fantasy for the most part.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So this is a good segue. We'll just start off. Why do you think research is so important in general, and then also why is it so important for fantasy, historical fantasy?
Okay. Well, I would definitely say that it's important for anything that you're writing really because it helps to create like solid world building. So, you can look up how things even if you're creating like a totally fantasy world, like let's say you're creating a fantasy world, where it's all winter all the time. So then it would be good to look at places like in a far northern climate, like Russia or Canada or places like that where it's always like really really cold, and see how those people live. What did they eat? What did they wear? What kind of houses did they have? All those kinds of things, and that helps even if your book is like complete fantasy, it helps you kind of be more realistic and believable in your fantasy. But I've seen really good examples of that even in like contemporary books too, where you just kind of like want to research. I don't know what teenagers are using, for technology and today or whatever. So just about world building and making things more realistic, I would say. Also, it makes me think of sci-fi books like The Martian.
Mhm.
I mean, like that had to have been hours and hours of research just to figure out like how life could be sustained on Mars. It adds something to every book, I would say.
Right. Okay. So it's just important to ground yourself no matter what you're writing.
Yes.
So for research, let's say you're starting to research as something you know nothing about, whether it's in fantasy or contemporary or whatever.
Hmm.
Where are some good starting places or jumping off points?
Well, I always I just start with like a Google search. And then but that always leads to like all these different tangents. You always hear us like talking about like going down the rabbit hole of research. It's because like you'll be researching one thing like food in the medieval period or whatever, and then all these other things will pop up, and you'll research that, and so I start there, but then depending on what it is, like for example with Beyond a Darkened Shore, I started just researching about medieval Ireland, but then I wanted to know more specific questions about like what life was like in the 11th century in Dublin, Ireland. So for that, I found a book that talked a lot about it and went into a lot of detail about it. So more specific questions, experts in the field are going to help you more, especially if they've written really comprehensive books like that. And me think what else. Oh yeah, and then with Beyond a Darkened Shore 2, it has Celtic mythology. So then, I researched a lot about Celtic mythology and just creatures of lore and the gods and the goddesses before the country converted to Christianity. And then that led me to wonder if there was a lingering belief in, even though they had converted to Christianity, a lingering belief in that, in the old gods and that kind of thing. So all of that. And then, Beyond a Darkened Shore was just like full of research, because then it has, it's got Norse mythology too. So research that, research Vikings, even like what it was like. We always picture Vikings, or we used to picture Vikings with like the horns and stuff on their helmets. Like what it was really like. What did they really wear in battle, and what did they really fight with?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, how do you make your research kind of fun or interactive? And kind of on that same note, how do you keep track of all the information that you've learned or that you've collected?
Oh, yeah. So, well, what I'd really like to do, one way that, if it's at all possible, I would say travel, like travel to Ireland, travel to Norway. I haven't been able to do that, but I would love to do that. Another way, though, that everyone can make it more interactive is like find documentaries, find shows to watch, even if they're not like completely reliable. Like I watched the History Channel show Vikings, like nonstop. So probably not everything in it is like absolutely historically accurate, but like enough to give you an idea of what life was like, and how do I keep track? Just what I really not as organized as I should be. What I really recommend to people is to use Scrivener, but I've just like never gotten the hang of it. It like there's just I always worry that I'm not using it to its fullest capabilities, because it's such a cool program. Yeah. But I would say that, because then you can like you can save picture. I've done it before. And it is like a really great program, but I end up doing like, saving bookmarks, and it's disorganized. Don't do what I do.
I think we'd all like to be more organized.
Yeah.
When you were writing your books and when other people are writing, do you recommend doing all your research before you write a single word, or do you just start writing and research as you go?
Well, I kind of do both. So like when I'm deciding on, like for Beyond a Darkened Shore, for example, I knew I wanted to write about Ireland because I love Ireland. So I was like researching different time periods in Ireland and seeing what was going on at the time, because it's always good to write about a time full of conflict and strife, And then I came across in my research that in the 11th century, the Vikings were all over Ireland. They were raiding Ireland. They took over Dublin. They were intermarrying the people. So it was like just full of conflict, So I was like, Irish and Viking, yes. But kind of both. I picked that time period, and then I started to write as the words flow, and then did more research along the way as the plot developed, just going back to stuff we talked about before, like what life was like at the time, and Celtic mythology and Norse mythology and all those types of things too, to really flesh out that world that I was creating.
Right. That sounds Vikings in Ireland. It sounds like a topic where there may or may not be a ton of research. If someone is writing about a period of history where there's not a lot of information, how do you make sure you're staying true to what little information there is available?
Yes. So this actually happened to me. My next book is coming out in 2019, and it's set in 11th century Russia.
Oh my
and
goodness.
This is just like not a well-known period of time. So there's some stuff out there, but what really helped is the more I researched, the more I found out that like the comprehensive book on that particular period in Russia was this one like obscure book written in like 1948. And so I tracked it down, like I found it and I bought it. And it really is a great book. It's like a tome that has just everything you could want to know about 11th century Russia.
Wow.
So I would say that if you're wanting to write something about a little known period in time, to try and track down as much, like expert research as you can. And then, I mean, you could research areas of time around there and then kind of make your own deductions
Right.
from there. Because you are writing, assuming you're writing fiction, you do have some creative license, you can kind of like guess how it would be, around that time period. But
Absolutely.
that's what I had to do is get the book and read that book. Um,
I imagine that it was a pretty large book. How did you decide when you were reading that? If there's so much information, how do you decide what to put in and what just maybe too much information or too much research piled on into fiction?
yeah, it's always like a balancing act. Especially when you're right, like when you're reading like tons and tons of stuff, and you just want to like put it all in there, but you kind of like you have to kind of pull yourself back because the more you write about like one particular thing, the more a reader is going to think it's significant. Like say you wrote 3 paragraphs on like one meal, like so they're going to think that's a significant meal, right? They're going to think like this meal is like poison or there's something like really important about this meal. And maybe you're, just like going off on all your research that you've done on food at the time.
Yeah.
So it's good to like kind of sprinkle things about that world that bring it to life. It's tricky. It's a balancing act. Some things that I've found though that typically really bring a world to life are things like the food. We all relate to that. What food people eat, what they wear. But then that's that. Like my example of the 3 paragraphs on one meal. Or, you don't want to spend paragraphs and paragraphs describing like one outfit. You just want to give like little clues about what they're wearing and what, like the example I gave before of like an all winter fantasy land or something, maybe you would talk about fur that they wore or heavy boots that they wore or whatever. So yeah, it is tricky when you want to like show everything you've researched, but you got to pull back a little bit.
It's got to be a fine balance.
Yeah.
Kind of on the same topic. How do you balance how do you draw the line between keeping things accurate and then allowing yourself to use creative license and telling a good story?
Yes. Well, as far as it works with my plot, I keep it. If it starts like messing up my plot, like say that one of my influences for a book was, I don't know, a prince who lived like 200 years before I'm writing, but I wanted to borrow aspects of his life, then I'll do it, but if it doesn't work with my timeline, then I'll just kind of tweak things until it does. And then that's what the author's note at the end is for. Like, I'm sorry, I made this up, But yeah. But I have been really lucky. Just and one of the things one of my really good examples I can't tell you because it's a spoiler for Beyond a Darkened Shore. There's something that happens there that really did happen in real life. And of course I've like kind of tweak some stuff about it to make it work for my story and what was going on. But the main events really did happen. So things like that are really fun because it's like, this actually works for my book. It's like history is working with my plot here.
That's great. Kind of, you touched on this before, but just to kind of jump back, when you're doing your research, how much do you use, besides the book that you mentioned, kind of experts in the field, and how do you recommend people use experts to build their world?
Okay, yeah, I actually did reach out. It was for one of my books published in or by Skyhorse, the one set in the Edwardian era, and it actually takes place in Bath, England, So, or part of it does. So, and this one is the Order of the Eternal Sun. And I actually reached out to people in England, in Bath. They were like part of the tourism for Bath, and like I found that like people involved in tourism, like they will answer your question, you know. But I definitely think it's good to reach out to experts if you've got some kind of weird, obscure question. You know, like I can't remember exactly what I wanted to know, but for example, like if you wanted to know, could they in Edwardian era England go to the Roman bathhouses in Bath at night, or were they closed at night, or whatever? You know, just like something that's kind of difficult to Google because it's so specific.
Right.
You know, that's when I would reach out to experts in the field.
Okay, so when you need to know really specific things,
Yes.
would you ever recommend, for example, when you were working on your books, did you ever have a expert read the book, or you just would use them kind of on a need to know basis?
I haven't done that yet, but I had just reached out to them through email
Mhm.
and just like kind of explained what I was writing at the time, and you know, could they help me with this like random question I had? But I think that's great too. Like if you're writing, you know, if you've got like if you're writing a Russian book, like if I had a Russian friend, you know, I'd be all over that, you know, read it and see if I'm using my Russian words correctly and that kind of thing. So utilize like the people that you know for sure.
Right, absolutely. Kind of segueing from there, when you're writing historical fiction, how do you approach keeping the character voices real without sounding too kind of old fashioned and maybe losing or alienating your younger readers who
Oh
perhaps want to read something that's in a slightly more modern voice? How do you
yeah.
feel about
That's a good question too. It is tricky because you want to be like accurate, but then obviously, so like for example, in 11th century Ireland, they're probably using like medieval, you know, like ye old, you know. So I'm not gonna do that. I
that?
just try and make it a little more formal than normal everyday speech, uh, but not to the point where and I don't like when people when you're reading stuff that is clearly medieval, like in research and stuff, where you cannot understand what they're talking about at all. So of course I wouldn't want to alienate readers, like you said, that way, for the sake of complete historical accuracy, Um, so avoid using ye old. Yeah.
Definitely won't be good.
Yeah.
um, so, kind of speaking on that, what books do you like to read? Like, what are some of your favorite historical fiction works, or some books that you read and you're like, oh my goodness, I need to get into this field.
Oh, yeah. Well, I actually like. I guess it's telling my age a little bit. Like when I was growing up and as a teenager, like they didn't really have a whole lot of YA. Certainly not like it is now. So I basically grew up reading like historical romance, like, set in Regency era London and all that kind of stuff. So that really, I mean, those romance authors did some serious research,
Yeah.
So that was kind of my start of interest in it. And then just like I love the Infernal Devices series,
Mhm.
and well, I wrote down a few and I knew I'd forget. I'm really bad at remembering like all the books I like.
Oh, you read
Yeah,
so much.
yeah. The Infernal Devices though, I love that. And Codename Verity.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, A Great and Terrible Beauty. A lot of the ones by Libba Bray are like really good. Or even books based on a real place, like Shadow and Bone. I
Mhm.
love the Shadow and Bone. The series is really good. So yeah, those are
Good one.
my top favorites. Yeah.
Awesome. What do you think when you're writing? What are some of the hardest things about writing historical fiction?
I mean, like it as much as I love to research, like the research, like trying to like find and trying to answer like really obscure questions to things like what would the road be like at the time? Or, that can be really difficult. What I mentioned before about organization,
Right.
yeah, I need to step up my organization game. I need to get into Scrivener more. Research can be really fun, but it can get overwhelming. And another thing too is like when you're writing,
Mhm.
and I do this, and I know I shouldn't because it breaks the flow of writing.
Mhm.
Is to stop and look something up instead of like just making a note to yourself, like, yeah, like research this later and
Right.
then coming back to it, after you've finished your thought process. And
Mhm.
and I don't, and I need to. So that's my recommendation for people. Don't do what I do. Don't break your flow of writing.
That makes sense. Um, so you talked a little bit about the research you did for Beyond a Darkened Shore, but tell us a little bit about what you're working on now. You mentioned your book coming out in 2019. What kind of research are you doing, or how's it going?
Yes. So this one is Through the White Wood, and it's set in 11th century Russia. So that's what I was talking about before, where it's like this obscure time period, and then I had to get that giant book on
Right.
it and try and figure out what life was like at the time.
How
And
did
it's
you? How did
another.
you? I have to know. How did you choose 11th century Russia?
So I've always like been interested in like Russian folklore and everything, and just like kind of like what I did with Beyond a Darkened Shore, just like kind of researching different time periods to figure out a really interesting time period or one that's little known, Um, but then it also worked with Beyond a Darkened Shore because the two main characters from Beyond a Darkened Shore they make an appearance in this book. I wouldn't say they're like central characters or anything, but they make an appearance, and that was due to the fact that apparently Vikings had their hand in settling Russia too. So,
Wow.
like the very first prince of medieval Russia was a Viking. So I know. So it was another thing where it was like, it's all lining up. So that I just kind of like stumbled into that, doing research, different time periods,
Yeah,
and what would work for kind of my idea.
that's wonderful. After after you're done with those two books, is there a historical period you have in mind that you'd love to work on for something in the future?
Well, I have like a secret project that I'm working on now that's like entirely fantasy, but it's probably like early civilization, I would say. So, and I can't say more than that, but yeah, there's I don't know, there's so many different time periods that really interest me. I've done Edwardian era, um, but in England, I've done 11th century, and that's kind of like a random time period. But medieval time period is really interesting. Yeah, there's so many. I don't know.
Too many to count.
There's too many. Yeah.
Um, Another question for you, and it's kind of we've touched on it before, but how do you know when to stop researching? I mean, when do you just say that you have enough? How do you avoid doing too little research, and then
Hmm.
how do you avoid doing too much and kind of losing yourself in research? When do
Oh
you know that you've done enough?
yeah. When you're like, that's it, I'm done. I mean, because even I don't know that it ever really stops, like when you finally turn your book into your publisher, from the final pass pages, I'd say. Because, like, seriously, with Beyond a Darkened Shore, there were things like I continued to have to look up because, my editor would get it and she'd say, well, what about this? And then you have to research that. And then the copy editor gets it and then you have to look up their questions. And so it goes on and on. So, yeah, when you turn in your very final copy, that's when you're done. Yeah.
We're almost running out of time, but I just have to ask this. I'm so curious. You mentioned that you used to be a psychotherapist,
Yeah.
correct?
Hmm.
I've got to know, how does that influence the way you approach your writing and your character development? 'Cause that's just so interesting.
Yeah, it has been really helpful for the psychology of characters. You know, we all want to bring characters to life. We all want to do, some serious character development and characterization. So it definitely helps with that. Just going back and really thinking, if this were a client sitting in front of me who had had this happen to her, how would she react? What is the most likely scenario for how she would react, or what would help her get through that? Or so it does help me, being a psychotherapist in my past, to think about the effect on characters. I was gonna say clients. They're my clients now. Yeah, but how it impacts them psychologically.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Do you have any final pieces of advice or tips and tricks for someone who wants to start writing historical fiction or fantasy? Anything you would?
I would say just really make sure it's a time period that you're really, really fascinated by, that you are willing to spend hours reading about and, going down the rabbit holes for, because that's what makes the most interesting work too, is something that you can tell that the writer was really enthusiastic about and knew a lot about, because then the reader feels more confident, isn't like, "Oh, I don't know that they would be wearing that in 11th or whatever, so it does help to be really enthusiastic about what you're researching.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's awesome. To end it off, tell us a little bit. When does Beyond a Darkened Shore come out, and what should
Okay.
we look?
It comes out April 10th of this year. It's finally 2018, so it's coming out soon. Um, it comes out April 10th. My Russian story, Through the White Wood, it'll come out in winter of 2019. But what HarperCollins calls winter is like it could be spring, like this one in April. So they haven't set an exact date yet. So I'm not sure about the exact day that it comes out, but winter 2019.
2019. All right, perfect. Well, we have run out of time, unfortunately, but everyone make sure to look for Beyond a Darkened Shore in April of this year, and winter 2019.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks. You too. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.